I'm Sarah Mitchell, 28, a kindergarten teacher who believed in fairy tale endings. When I told my boyfriend Marcus about our baby, I expected tears of joy, maybe a proposal. Instead, his mother appeared at my door 3 days later with a briefcase, full of cash and a contract that would erase me from their lives forever. The betrayal cut deeper than I imagined possible. Here I was, carrying their grandchild, and they saw me as nothing more than a problem to be solved with money. But what I discovered about the Wellington family's secrets would change everything, not just for me, but for the child I was carrying and the truth that had been buried for decades. You see, Mrs. Wellington made one crucial mistake. She assumed I was just another naive girl who could be bought. She didn't know about my late father's legal background or that I'd grown up watching him fight for the underdog. She certainly didn't know that the very contract she brought to silence me would become the key to unraveling their carefully constructed lies. Sometimes, the people who try to silence you are the ones with the most to hide. And sometimes being underestimated is the greatest weapon you can have. If you've ever felt powerless against wealth and manipulation, this story is for you. 2 weeks earlier, my life had been perfect. Marcus Wellington and I had been dating for 8 months, and every day felt like a gift. He was everything I dreamed of: tall, successful, with kind eyes that crinkled when he laughed at my terrible jokes. We'd met at a charity gala where his family's foundation was donating to local schools. I was there representing my kindergarten class, feeling completely out of place in my borrowed dress among all that wealth and sophistication. Marcus changed that. He saw me standing awkwardly by the dessert table, approached with a warm smile, and spent the entire evening talking about education reform and children's literacy. No pretense, no condescension, just genuine interest in my work and my students. When he asked me to dinner the next week, I actually pinched myself in the bathroom mirror. The pregnancy test changed everything. 2 pink lines stared back at me from the small plastic stick, and my heart soared. I'd always wanted children, always imagined myself as a mother. With Marcus, it felt like the universe was finally aligning. We talked about the future, about family, about how we both wanted kids someday. This was just someday arriving a little sooner than planned. I spent hours planning how to tell him. I wanted it to be perfect, memorable, something we'd tell our child about years later. I settled on cooking his favorite meal, lighting candles, and presenting the test in a small gift box with a note that read, "Our greatest adventure begins now." I even bought a bottle of sparkling cider to celebrate. The evening was set for Friday. I'd taken the afternoon off, spent 3 hours preparing beef Wellington ironic, considering his family name, and arranged everything just so. The apartment smelled like rosemary and love, candles flickered warmly, and I'd even put on the blue dress he'd complimented of our second date. When Marcus arrived, he seemed different. Distracted. He kissed me hello, but his mind was clearly elsewhere. I chalked it up to work stress. He'd been dealing with some family business issues lately. I thought my news would be the perfect remedy. "I have something for you," I said, producing the gift box with shaking hands. My excitement was barely contained. "Something wonderful?" He opened it slowly, his expression shifting from curiosity to confusion to something I couldn't quite read. When he saw the pregnancy test, his face went completely blank. Not joy. Not surprise. Just nothing. "Sarah," he said quietly, setting the box down like it contained something dangerous. "We need to talk." The rest of the evening dissolved into a blur of hurt and confusion. Marcus sat across from me at the carefully set table, the untouched Wellington growing cold between us, and explained that this complicated things. He needed time to think. He needed to talk to his family. He needed space. I stared at him, this man I thought I knew, and felt the first crack in my fairy tale begin to spread. The positive pregnancy test sat between us like an accusation. And I realized that sometimes the people we love the most are the ones we understand the least. Marcus left that night without touching his dinner, without touching me. He mumbled something about calling me in a few days and disappeared into the hallway, leaving me alone with my shattered expectations and a positive pregnancy test that suddenly felt like evidence of my own stupidity. I spent the weekend in a haze of confusion and morning sickness. Every time my phone buzzed, I lunged for it, hoping it was Marcus calling to apologize, to explain, to say he'd been in shock and now he was thrilled. But the calls never came. Just silence, stretching longer and longer until I began to question everything I thought I knew about our relationship. By Monday, I was desperate enough to drive to his office. Wellington and Associates occupied the top 3 floors of a gleaming downtown tower, all glass and steel and old money respectability. I'd only been there once before, when Marcus had taken me to lunch and introduced me to a few colleagues. They'd been polite but distant, the kind of polite that wealthy people reserve for those they consider beneath them. The receptionist, a sharp-eyed woman named Jennifer, recognized me immediately. "Miss Mitchell," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Wellington isn't in today. He's taking some personal time. 3 days after I told him I was pregnant." I thanked her and left, but something in her expression, a flicker of pity, maybe, or knowledge, made my stomach clench. I was getting into my car when I heard it. Marcus's voice carrying across the parking garage. He was on his phone, pacing near a black Mercedes, gesturing animatedly as he spoke. I should have driven away. I should have given him the space he'd asked for. Instead, I sat in my car and listened. "I know, Mother. I know it's a problem." His voice was strained, higher than normal. "But I can't just make it go away. She's different from the others. The others." My blood turned to ice. "No, I don't think she'd take money. She's one of those idealistic types. A teacher, for God's sake. She probably thinks we're going to get married and live happily ever after." I watched him through my windshield, this man I thought I loved, talking about me like I was a business problem to be solved. The Marcus I knew, the one who'd listened to me talk about my students, who'd held my hand during sad movies, who'd made me feel like I was worth something, was gone. And his place was a stranger, cold and calculating. "Fine," he said finally. "I'll stay away from her until you handle it. But make it clean, Mother. I don't want her hurt more than necessary." "Handle it." The words echoed in my mind as I watched him end the call and stride back into the building. Handle it like I was a pest to be exterminated, like our relationship, our baby, meant nothing more than an inconvenience to be managed. I drove home with my hands shaking, the reality of my situation finally sinking in. I wasn't Marcus's girlfriend anymore. I was a problem. And from what I'd just heard, Mrs. Wellington was already working on a solution. That night, I sat in my apartment with a cup of tea, staring at the positive pregnancy test I'd left on my kitchen counter. For the first time since seeing those 2 pink lines, I felt truly alone. Not just abandoned, but completely isolated from the life I thought I was building. Got my phone sat silent on the table. No calls from Marcus. No apologies. No explanations. Just the echo of his voice talking about handling me. And the growing certainty that whatever came next, I'd be facing it alone. The Wellington family had always been a mystery to me. In 8 months of dating Marcus, I'd met his mother exactly twice both times at carefully orchestrated public events where she'd been gracious but distant. She was the kind of woman who commanded attention without demanding it, all sharp edges and old money elegance. Victoria Wellington ran the family foundation with an iron fist and a spotless reputation. Their estate sat on 40 acres outside the city, a sprawling Georgian mansion that had been in the family for 3 generations. The first time Marcus brought me there, I'd been intimidated by the sheer scale of it, the circular drive, the manicured gardens, the way the house seemed to loom over everything like a monument to wealth and privilege. Inside, family portraits lined the walls in heavy gold frames. Generation after generation of Wellingtons stared down with the same piercing blue eyes, the same set jaw, the same expression of entitled confidence. But there was something missing from the most recent portrait, the one that hung in the main hallway, painted just 5 years ago. It showed Victoria Wellington seated regally in a wingback chair, with Marcus standing behind her, his hand on her shoulder. The composition was perfect, the lighting dramatic, the message clear. This was the Wellington legacy. But the space on the left side of the portrait was oddly empty, as if someone had been painted out or simply never included. When I'd asked Marcus about it, he'd brushed off my question with a vague comment about artistic choice. But I'd noticed the way his jaw tightened, the way he'd quickly steered me toward another room. Even then, some part of me had known he was lying. The Wellington money came from real estate development, a business started by Marcus's grandfather. In the 1950s, they'd bought up farmland on the outskirts of the city and turned it into shopping centers, office complexes, and luxury housing developments. By the time Marcus's father died 10 years ago, the company was worth hundreds of millions. Marcus was the only heir, the golden child who'd been groomed since birth to take over the family empire. He'd gone to the right schools, married the right people, or at least he was supposed to. I'd always wondered why someone like him was still single at 32, why he'd never been married despite his obvious catch status. Victoria Wellington controlled every aspect of the family's public image. She served on museum boards, hosted charity galas, and made sure the Wellington name appeared in all the right society pages. She was the kind of woman who measured success in newspaper clippings and social media mentions, who treated relationships like business arrangements. The family foundation was her pet project, a carefully curated charity that focused on education and children's welfare. It was through their work that I'd first met Marcus, and I'd been impressed by their commitment to helping underprivileged kids. But now, remembering the cold calculation in his voice when he talked about handling me, I wondered if even their charity work was just another form of reputation management. There had been rumors over the years, whispered gossip in the social circles I'd occasionally found myself in. Stories about the Wellington family's ruthless business practices, about people who'd crossed them and mysteriously lost their jobs or their funding. But these were always vague, always third-hand stories that seemed too dramatic to be true. I'd dismissed them as jealousy, the kind of rumors that always swirled around wealthy families. Marcus had seemed so genuine, so different from the cold corporate stereotype. He'd laughed at my jokes, remembered my students' names, brought me coffee when I was grading papers late into the night. He'd been real in a way that his family's public persona never was, but now I was beginning to understand that the Marcus I'd known might have been just another carefully constructed image. The real Marcus was the one who'd called me a problem and asked his mother to handle me. The real Marcus was the one who'd inherited not just his family's wealth, but their willingness to treat people as disposable. As I sat in my apartment that evening, I found myself thinking about that empty space in the family portrait. Someone had been erased from the Wellington legacy, someone who'd been deemed unworthy of their perfect family image. And I was beginning to suspect that I was about to find out exactly what happened to people who didn't fit into Victoria Wellington's carefully controlled world. She arrived on a Tuesday morning, precisely at 9 o'clock. I was getting ready for work, running a brush through my hair and trying to keep down the tea and toast that constituted my latest attempt at managing morning sickness. The doorbell rang with the kind of authority that suggested the visitor was used to being answered immediately. Through the peephole, I saw Victoria Wellington standing in my hallway like she owned it. She was impeccably dressed in a navy suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, holding a slim leather briefcase in one manicured hand. Her silver hair was pulled back in a perfect chignon, and her expression was as cold and composed as marble. I opened the door because what else could I do? You don't ignore Victoria Wellington when she comes calling, especially not when you're carrying her son's child and he's been avoiding your calls for 3 days. "Sarah," she said, stepping into my apartment without invitation. "We need to talk." My small living room seemed to shrink around her presence. She took in the space with a single sweep of her eyes, the second-hand furniture, the stack of student papers on my coffee table, the framed photo of my parents on the mantel. Her gaze lingered on the pregnancy test that I'd left on the kitchen counter, still in its little gift box like a monument to my own naivety. "Please sit," she said, as if this were her home instead of mine. She settled into my armchair with the kind of casual authority that rich people seem to be born with. "I believe we can resolve this situation quickly and cleanly." Situation. Not pregnancy, not grandchild. Situation. "Mrs. Wellington," I began, but she held up a hand to stop me. "I know what you're thinking," she said, opening her briefcase with precise movements. "You believe this is about love, about family, about some romantic notion of happily ever after. But let me be clear, this is about damage control." She pulled out a stack of papers, neatly bound and official looking. My name was already typed at the top in bold letters. Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, confidentiality agreement and release of claims. "Marcus is heir to a considerable fortune," she continued, her voice as smooth and cold as winter glass. "He has responsibilities, obligations that extend far beyond his personal desires. A relationship with you and certainly a child would be incompatible with those responsibilities." I stared at the contract, my heart pounding. The words swam in front of my eyes. Cease all contact, renounce all claims, maintain absolute confidentiality. This was real. This was actually happening. "I'm prepared to offer you $100,000, she said, reaching into the briefcase again. This time she pulled out bound stacks of cash, more money than I'd ever seen in one place. "In exchange, you'll sign this agreement, terminate the pregnancy, and never contact Marcus or anyone in our family again." The money sat on my coffee table like an accusation. $100 bills, crisp and new, arranged in neat piles. It was more than I made in 2 years of teaching. It was enough to pay off my student loans, to buy a house, to change my life completely. "You can't be serious," I whispered. "I'm always serious about protecting my family," she replied. "This is a generous offer, Sarah, more generous than you deserve, considering the circumstances." "The circumstances?" My voice was getting stronger, anger beginning to cut through the shock. "You mean the circumstances of being pregnant with your grandchild?" Her laugh was sharp as broken glass. "My grandchild, please. You're a kindergarten teacher from a middle-class family. You have no idea what it means to be a Wellington, what that name represents. This child, if it even exists, would be nothing more than a burden to Marcus and an embarrassment to our family." The casual cruelty of her words hit me like a physical blow. "If it even exists," as if my pregnancy were some elaborate scheme, as if the morning sickness and exhaustion and overwhelming terror-joy of carrying life were all just props in a con game. "Marcus doesn't know you're here," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I knew they weren't true. "Marcus asked me to handle this," she said with a slight smile. "He's quite skilled at many things, but confrontation has never been his strong suit. He prefers to let me manage the unpleasant details." Handle this, the same words I'd heard him use on the phone. I was an unpleasant detail to be managed. "You have 24 hours to consider my offer," she said, standing and smoothing down her skirt. "After that, I'll be forced to take less. Pleasant measures to protect my family's interests." She moved toward the door, leaving the contract and the money on my coffee table like contamination. "Oh, and Sarah," she said, pausing at the threshold, "don't bother trying to contact Marcus. He's already made his choice. This is just me being kind enough to give you a way out with your dignity intact." The door closed behind her with a soft click, and I was alone with $100,000 and a contract that would erase me from the Wellington family history. I sank onto my couch, staring at the money, and realized that Victoria Wellington had just made the same mistake Marcus had. She'd underestimated me. She'd looked at my modest apartment and my teacher's salary and seen someone who could be bought. She'd seen someone weak, someone desperate, someone who would take the money and disappear quietly into the night. She hadn't seen my father's daughter. She hadn't seen the woman who'd spent her childhood watching him fight for justice, who'd learned that sometimes the most powerful weapon you can have is the knowledge that you're right. She hadn't seen the person who was about to turn her own contract into the rope. She'd hang herself with Dot. I picked up the contract and began to read. Really read, with the kind of attention to detail that my father had taught me. And as I read, I began to smile, because Victoria Wellington, in her arrogance and her certainty that she could buy her way out of any problem, had just made a very expensive mistake. After Victoria Wellington left, I sat in my living room for a long time, staring at the contract and the money. The silence felt different now, not empty, but charged with possibility. I thought about my father, about the lessons he'd taught me without either of us realizing it. David Mitchell had been a small-town lawyer who specialized in workers' rights and civil liberties. He'd never made much money, but he'd made a difference. Our dinner table conversations had been filled with stories about David versus Goliath cases, about standing up to powerful corporations and corrupt officials. He'd taught me that the law wasn't just about rules, it was about justice, about protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. I walked to my bedroom closet and pulled out a box I hadn't opened in 3 years. Inside were my father's law books, yellowed with age and filled with his careful annotations. Constitutional law, contract law, civil rights litigation. I'd kept them after he died, not knowing why. Just unable to throw them away. Now I knew why. I carried the contract law textbook to my kitchen table and opened it next to Victoria Wellington's agreement. The pages were filled with my father's handwriting notes about unconscionable contracts, about agreements that could be voided due to duress or fraud. I could almost hear his voice as I read his margin notes. Always look for what they're not saying. The real power is in the silence. The Wellington contract was 12 pages long, dense with legal terminology designed to intimidate. But as I read through it carefully, I began to see the cracks. The language was overly broad, the terms potentially unenforceable. Most importantly, it contained admissions that Victoria Wellington probably didn't realize she was making. The contract acknowledged that I was pregnant with Marcus Wellington's child. It acknowledged that the Wellington family considered this pregnancy a threat to their reputation and financial interests. It acknowledged that they were willing to pay a substantial sum to keep me quiet. In their eagerness to silence me, they'd created a paper trail that proved everything they were trying to hide. I made coffee and settled in for a long night of reading. My father's books were full of case studies about contracts like this one agreements that wealthy families had used to silence inconvenient women throughout history. But they were also full of stories about those contracts being successfully challenged, about women who'd fought back, and one dot by morning, I had a plan. It wasn't about the money, though. I had to admit that $100,000 was tempting to someone living on a teacher's salary. It was about something deeper. It was about refusing to be erased, refusing to let the Wellington family treat me like I was disposable. I called in sick to work and spent the day researching the Wellington family's history. What I found was fascinating. Victoria Wellington had been married to Marcus's father for 25 years. But she'd been involved in the family business long before that. She'd grown up in money, married into more money, and had spent her entire adult life protecting the family's reputation, but reputations that need constant protection usually have something to hide. Found newspaper clippings about the Wellington Foundation's charitable work, about their donations to local schools and hospitals. I found society page photos of Victoria at galas and fundraisers. I found business articles about the families, real estate empire, and their expansion into new markets. What I didn't find was any mention of other women in Marcus's life. No ex-wives, no long-term girlfriends, no previous relationships that had made it into the public record. For a 32-year-old man from a prominent family, that was unusual. It suggested that either Marcus had been remarkably private about his personal life, or that someone had been very good at keeping inconvenient relationships out of the public eye. That evening, I made a decision that would change everything. I picked up the phone and called the number on the business card. I'd found in my father's papers a private investigator named Janet Chun who'd worked with him on several cases. Janet was retired now, but she agreed to meet me for coffee the next morning. As I prepared for bed, I looked at the contract one more time. Victoria Wellington had given me 24 hours to consider her offer. In less than 12 hours, I was supposed to call her with my decision. She was expecting me to take the money and disappear, to sign away my rights and my child's future for the sake of Wellington family convenience. Instead, I was going to do something she'd never expect. I was going to fight back, not with anger or emotion, but with the methodical, strategic approach my father had taught me. I was going to use their own contract against them, and I was going to make them pay for underestimating Sarah Mitchell's. The money still sat on my coffee table, neat stacks of hundreds that represented more financial security than I'd ever known. But as I turned off the lights and headed to bed, I knew I wouldn't be taking it, because some things, dignity, justice, the right to exist without shame, were worth more than money. And tomorrow, I was going to start showing the Wellington family exactly what those things were worth. Janet Chun was exactly what I'd expected from reading my father's case notes, sharp, direct, and utterly without nonsense. She was in her early 60s, with silver-streaked hair and the kind of focused intensity that came from 30 years of uncovering other people's secrets. We met at a small cafe downtown, far from anywhere I might run into Marcus or his family. "David Mitchell's daughter," she said, settling into the booth across from me. "I should have known you'd end up needing my services eventually. You've got..." His eyes and his stubborn streak, I'm guessing. I told her everything. The pregnancy, Marcus's reaction, his mother's visit, the contract, and the money. Janet listened without interruption, taking notes in a small notebook that she kept close to her chest. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. 100,000, she said finally. "That's not hush money, honey. That's terror money. People don't pay that kind of cash unless they're genuinely afraid of what you might uncover. So you'll help me?" She smiled, and I saw something fierce in her expression. "Your father helped me get started in this business when everyone else thought a woman couldn't be a private investigator. I owe him that much. But more than that, I've seen what families like the Wellingtons can do to people who get in their way. If you want to fight them, you're going to need ammunition." We spent the next hour planning my strategy. Janet would begin a formal investigation into the Wellington family's business practices and personal history. I would continue researching their public records and financial dealings. Most importantly, I would document everything, every interaction, every threat, every attempt to silence me. "The key," Janet explained, "is to understand what they're really afraid of. It's not just about you and the baby. If they were willing to pay 100,000 to make you disappear, there's something bigger at stake. Something that threatens their entire house of cards." Over the next few days, I threw myself into research with the kind of intensity I usually reserve for lesson planning I combed through public records, business filings, and news articles. I created timelines and charts, mapping out the Wellington family's history and looking for patterns. What I found was a family that had been very good at keeping secrets. The Wellington Foundation's tax returns showed large donations to various charities, but the recipients were often vague or difficult to track down. The family's real estate holdings were spread across multiple shell companies, making it nearly impossible to determine their true worth or the source of their investments. But it was the personal history that proved most interesting. Victoria Wellington had been married twice, once briefly in her early 20s to a man named Robert Hayes, then to Marcus's father, Jonathan Wellington. The first marriage had ended in divorce within 2 years, with no public explanation. The second marriage had lasted until Jonathan's death 10 years ago, but there were odd gaps in the family's public appearances. During certain years, Janet's investigation was turning up even more intriguing information. She'd spoken to former employees of Wellington and Associates, people who'd worked for the family over the years. The stories they told painted a picture of a family that demanded absolute loyalty and dealt harshly with anyone who crossed them. There's a pattern, Janet explained during one of our meetings. People who work for the Wellingtons either stay forever or leave suddenly. There's no middle ground. And the ones who leave suddenly, they don't talk about why. They just disappear from the industry entirely. The most disturbing discovery came from a former housekeeper named Maria Santos. She'd worked for the Wellington family for 15 years before abruptly quitting 5 years ago. Janet had tracked her down to a small apartment across town where she was raising her granddaughter. Alone. I can't talk about the Wellingtons, Maria had said initially. But when Janet mentioned my name and my situation, something in her expression changed. Another girl? She'd whispered. Dios mío, not another one. Maria wouldn't say more, but she'd agreed to meet with me privately. The meeting was set for the following evening at a restaurant in her neighborhood. Janet warned me to be careful, to watch for anyone who might be following me. The Wellington family had resources, and they wouldn't hesitate to use them if they felt threatened. As I prepared for the meeting with Maria, I felt a mixture of excitement and fear. I was getting closer to understanding what the Wellingtons were really hiding, but I was also moving into dangerous territory. These people had already shown they were willing to pay substantial sums to protect their secrets. What else might they be willing to do? I looked at the contract one more time before leaving my apartment. Victoria Wellington's 24-hour deadline had passed 2 days ago, and I hadn't called her. I knew she was probably furious, probably planning her next move. But I also knew that I was no longer the naive teacher who'd opened her door to a briefcase full of cash. I was David, Mitchell's daughter, and I was about to show the Wellington family exactly what that meant. Maria Santos was a small woman with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of decades of hard work. She sat across from me in the corner booth of a family-owned Mexican restaurant, nervously shredding her napkin as she spoke in careful, measured sentences. I shouldn't be talking to you, she said for the third time. They made me sign papers. Legal papers that said I could never discuss what I saw in that house. What kind of papers? I asked gently. I'd learned from my father that the best way to get information was to listen more than you spoke, to create space for people to fill with their own truths. Like the ones they probably gave you, she said, looking at me with sudden understanding. Money to keep quiet, money to disappear. She reached into her purse and pulled out a worn envelope. From it, she extracted a death certificate yellowed with age, creased from being folded and unfolded many times. The name on it read, Jennifer Marie Hayes, age 24. Cause of death listed as acute cardiac failure due to drug overdose. She was so young, Maria whispered. Younger than you. And she was pregnant too. My blood turned to ice. When was this? 7 years ago. She was Marcus's girlfriend then, just like you. Sweet girl, came from a working family. She was a nurse at the children's hospital. Maria's eyes filled with tears. She was so excited about the baby. She used to talk to me while I cleaned, showed me the ultrasound pictures, talked about names. What happened to her? Maria shook her head. The official story? She had a drug problem, overdosed in her apartment. But I knew that girl for 2 years, and she never touched anything stronger than aspirin. She was healthy, happy, planning her future with Marcus. The implications of what Maria was telling me crashed over me like a wave. Another pregnant woman, another inconvenient girlfriend, another woman who'd been erased from the Wellington family history. Mrs. Wellington told me Jennifer was dangerous, Maria continued. Said she was trying to trap Marcus, trying to ruin the family. Then one day, Jennifer just wasn't around anymore. Mrs. Wellington said she'd moved away, found someone else. But then I saw the death certificate in the newspaper. How did you get a copy of the certificate? Jennifer's sister gave it to me. She didn't believe the overdose story either. She tried to get the police to investigate, but ... double quotes, Maria shrugged helplessly. The Wellingtons have friends everywhere. The investigation was closed quickly, too quickly. I studied the death certificate, my hands trembling slightly. The date was significant. It was exactly 3 months after Jennifer would have been showing. Exactly the time when hiding a pregnancy would have become impossible. There's something else, Maria said, reaching into the envelope again. This time she pulled out a photograph, a young woman with dark hair and a bright smile, holding an ultrasound picture. Jennifer gave me this the week before she died. She wanted someone to remember that her baby existed, even if the Wellingtons tried to erase them both. The photograph hit me harder than any evidence could have. This wasn't just about contracts and legal documents anymore. This was about a real person, a real baby, a real life that had been snuffed out to protect the Wellington family's reputation. Did Marcus know? I asked, about what really happened. Maria's expression grew troubled. Marcus was different after Jennifer died. Distant, cold. He used to be kinder, more human. But after that, it was like something in him broke. Or maybe something in him was finally revealed. I thought about the Marcus I'd known or thought I'd known. The gentle man who'd held doors for me, who'd remembered my students' names, who'd seemed genuinely interested in making the world a better place. Had that all been an act? Or had grief and guilt turned him into someone else entirely? Why are you telling me this? I asked Maria. She looked at me with fierce determination. Because I couldn't save Jennifer. I was just the housekeeper nobody. Listen to me, nobody cared what I thought. But you're different. You're educated. You have resources. Maybe you can do what I couldn't. What's that? Stop them from doing it again. Maria's words echoed in my mind as I drove home through the dark streets. Another woman, another pregnancy, another convenient death. The pattern was clear, and it was terrifying. The Wellington family didn't just pay women to disappear. They made sure they disappeared permanently when money wasn't enough. Thought about Victoria Wellington's threat. I'll be forced to take less pleasant measures to protect my family's interests. At the time, I'd assumed she meant legal action, maybe. Harassment or intimidation. Now I understood that her definition of less pleasant might be far more sinister than I'd imagined. When I got home, I immediately called Janet Chun and told her what I'd learned. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Jesus, Sarah, she said finally, this changes everything. If they killed one pregnant girlfriend, they won't hesitate to kill another. You need to be very careful from now on. What do you mean? I mean, you need to start thinking like someone whose life is in danger, because it probably is. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my hand resting on my still flat stomach. Inside me, a tiny life was growing. Marcus's child, Victoria. Wellington's grandchild, Jennifer Hayes' spiritual sibling. A life that powerful people had already decided was inconvenient. But as I lay there in the darkness, I felt something I hadn't expected: determination. Jennifer Hayes had died alone, with only a housekeeper to remember her story. Her baby had been erased from history, forgotten by everyone except Maria Santos. That wasn't going to happen to me. I was going to make sure everyone knew what the Wellington family was capable of. I was going to honor Jennifer's memory by exposing the truth. And I was going to protect my child in a way that Jennifer had never had the chance to protect hers. The war between me and the Wellington family was no longer about money or contracts or even justice. It was about survival. And I intended to be the one left standing when it was over. Finding Jennifer Hayes' sister took Janet 3 days and several carefully placed phone calls. Lisa Hayes lived in a modest apartment complex on the outskirts of the city, working 2 jobs to support herself and her 8-year-old daughter. When I called her, the weariness in her voice was immediate and familiar. "If this is about my sister, I've already told the police everything I know," she said. "And if you're working for the Wellingtons, you can tell them their money can't buy." My silence anymore. "I'm not working for them," I said quickly. "I'm fighting them. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I think they're trying to do to me what they did to Jennifer." The silence that followed was long enough that I wondered if she'd hung up. Then, quietly, "You're pregnant too, aren't you?" "Yes." Jesus, they never learn. Her voice was tired, defeated. Or maybe they just think they can keep getting away with it. We agreed to meet at her apartment that evening. Lisa Hayes looked like her sister, the same dark hair, the same delicate features, but where Jennifer's face had been open and trusting in the photograph, Lisa's was marked by grief and anger. That had settled into permanent lines around her eyes. Her daughter, Emma, was doing homework at the kitchen table while we talked in the living room. The apartment was small but clean, filled with the kind of careful touches that spoke of someone making the best of limited resources. On the mantel sat a framed photograph of Jennifer, surrounded by candles and fresh flowers. "I keep a shrine," Lisa said, noticing my gaze. "Emma asks about her aunt sometimes. I tell her Jennifer was a hero, that she tried to help people. It's not exactly a lie." She poured coffee and settled across from me on a worn couch. "Jennifer met Marcus at the hospital where she worked. He'd come in with a broken wrist from a skiing accident, and she was his nurse. She said he was different from other rich guys she'd met, kinder, more genuine. Sound familiar?" I nodded, remembering my own first impressions of Marcus. They dated for 6 months before she got pregnant. She was over the moon about it. Called. Me crying with happiness, talking about how Marcus was going to propose, how they were going to have this beautiful family together. Lisa's voice grew bitter. She was so naive. We both were. "What happened when she told him about the pregnancy?" "Same thing that happened to you, I'm guessing." He panicked, said he needed time, disappeared for a few days. Then his mother showed up. Lisa walked to a small desk in the corner and returned with a folder thick with documents. I kept everything. Every piece of paper, every photograph, every scrap of evidence. The police wouldn't listen, but I knew someday someone would. She handed me a contract identical to the one Victoria Wellington had brought me, except this one was signed. Jennifer's signature was at the bottom, shaky and uncertain. "She took the money?" I asked. She was scared. Mrs. Wellington didn't just threaten her, she threatened me, our parents, Jennifer's job at the hospital. She said she'd make sure Jennifer never worked as a nurse again, that our family would be destroyed financially. Jennifer signed to protect us, but there was more. Lisa showed me bank records indicating that Jennifer had never actually received the full payment. After signing the contract, she'd gotten only $20,000, just enough to cover her immediate expenses and moving costs. They were going to pay her the rest after she ... Lisa's voice broke after she terminated the pregnancy, but Jennifer couldn't do it. She tried to leave town instead, tried to start over somewhere else. That's when things got dangerous. Lisa pulled out another document, a copy of a restraining order that Jennifer had filed against Marcus just 2 weeks before her death. The petition described a pattern of harassment and stalking, of threatening phone calls and cars following her home from work. She was terrified, Lisa continued. She called me the night before she died, said she thought someone had been in her apartment. She'd come home and found things moved around, her laptop missing. She was going to call the police in the morning, but she died that night. Overdosed that night, Lisa corrected with air quotes. The autopsy found enough heroin in her system to kill a horse. But Jennifer was afraid of needles. She'd passed out during blood draws her entire life. The idea that she'd inject herself with anything was laughable. The evidence Lisa showed me painted a clear picture of murder disguised as suicide. The crime scene photos, which she'd obtained through a private investigator, showed Jennifer's apartment, staged to look like a drug den. Needles and drug paraphernalia that hadn't been there during previous police visits. A suicide note typed on a computer with no handwriting samples to verify authenticity. Most damning of all was a locket that Lisa had found in Jennifer's apartment after the police had cleared the scene. Inside was a photograph of Jennifer and a man I didn't recognize, not Marcus, but someone older, with sharp features and cold eyes. That's Thomas Crawford, Lisa explained. He works for the Wellington family. Security, they call it, but he's more like a cleaner. He makes problems disappear. The implications made my stomach turn. The Wellington family didn't just have lawyers and accountants on their payroll. They had someone who specialized in permanent solutions to inconvenient problems. Why didn't you take this to the media? I asked. Lisa laughed bitterly. I tried. But the Wellingtons own half the journalists in the city, and the other half won't touch a story without concrete proof. What I have is circumstantial evidence, and the word of a grieving sister against one of the most powerful families in the state. As I prepared to leave, Lisa grabbed my arm. Promise me something, she said. Promise me you won't end up like Jennifer. Promise me you'll be smarter, more careful, more prepared than she was. I promise, I said, and I meant it. But as I drove home through the dark streets, I realized that my promise might be harder to keep than I'd thought. If the Wellington family had killed once to protect their secrets, they wouldn't hesitate to kill again. The only question was whether I could expose them before they decided I'd become too dangerous to leave alive. The medical records arrived 3 days later, delivered by Janet in a manila envelope marked confidential. She'd obtained them through a contact at the insurance company, not entirely legal, but not entirely illegal either, existing in the gray area where most private investigation work lived. You're not going to like what you find in there, Janet warned as she handed me the envelope. But it explains a lot about why Marcus is so willing to let his mother control his life. Inside were Marcus Wellington's medical records from the past 10 years. At first glance, they seemed routine annual checkups, a few minor injuries, standard blood work. But buried in the psychological evaluation section was something that changed everything. I thought I knew about the man I'd been in love with. Marcus had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder at age 22, following what the records described as a severe manic episode with psychotic features. He'd been hospitalized for 6 weeks, during which time he'd required intensive psychiatric care and medication management. The episode had been triggered by stress related to his father's death and the pressure of inheriting the family business. But it wasn't the diagnosis itself that shocked me. Mental illness was nothing to be ashamed of. And plenty of people lived full, successful lives while managing bipolar disorder. What shocked me was the pattern of manipulation surrounding his treatment. The records showed that Victoria Wellington had been granted medical power of attorney over her adult son, citing his inability to make rational decisions regarding his care. She controlled his medication, his therapy appointments, even his access to his own medical information. According to the notes, Marcus had attempted several times to regain control of his treatment, but each attempt had been blocked by his mother's legal maneuvering. Most disturbing of all were the medication records. Marcus was being prescribed a cocktail of mood stabilizers and antipsychotics that, according to my father's old medical textbooks, would have left him emotionally blunted and highly susceptible to external control. The dosages were on the high end of therapeutic ranges, just shy of what might be considered chemical restraint. I thought about the Marcus I'd known, the way he'd sometimes seemed distant or detached, the occasions when his responses had felt rehearsed or artificial. I'd attributed it to the natural reserve of someone from a wealthy family, but now I wondered if what I'd been seeing was a man whose emotions were being chemically suppressed. There was more. The records included notes from a psychiatrist who treated Marcus briefly 5 years ago around the time of Jennifer Hayes' death. Dr. Rebecca Martinez had documented concerns about Marcus's excessive guilt and self-blame regarding a recent traumatic event. She'd recommended therapy to address what appeared to be PTSD symptoms, but her treatment had been terminated abruptly after just 3 sessions. The termination notice was signed by Victoria Wellington, citing lack of progress and concerns about therapeutic approach. But Dr. Martinez's notes told a different story. She'd written that Marcus was beginning to process feelings of complicity in a tragic outcome and was expressing desire to take responsibility for past actions. In other words, Marcus had been getting better, starting to think for himself, beginning to feel genuine remorse for what had happened to Jennifer. So his mother had pulled him out of therapy and increased his medication. I stared at the medical records, feeling a complex mix of emotions. Part of me was angry at Victoria Wellington for her manipulation, at Marcus for his weakness, at the entire situation that had robbed my child of a father who might have been capable of love if he'd been allowed to be himself. But part of me also felt something unexpected. Pity that Marcus Wellington wasn't just a coward who had let his mother handle his problems. He was a victim too, trapped in a system of control that had been designed to keep him compliant and manageable. His mother had turned his mental illness into a tool for manipulation, using his vulnerability to maintain her power over the family empire. It didn't excuse his actions. He was still responsible for the choices he'd made, still complicit in what had happened to Jennifer and what was happening to me. But it explained them in a way that made the whole situation even more tragic. Marcus was a prisoner in a cage made of medication and legal documents, and his mother held all the keys. Thought about the phone call I'd overheard in the parking garage, when he told his mother I was different from the others. Maybe what he'd meant was that I was the first woman who'd made him want to fight against his chemical constraints. The first one who'd made him feel something strong, enough to break through the pharmaceutical fog his mother kept him in. But wanting to fight and being able to fight were 2 different things. The medical records showed just how thoroughly Victoria Wellington controlled every aspect of her son's life. She monitored his bank accounts, managed his medication, controlled his access to legal counsel. She turned him into a puppet, and she was very good at pulling his strings. The question was, could the puppet ever cut his own strings? And if he could, would he do it in time to save me and our child from the same fate that had befallen Jennifer Hayes? As I closed the medical file, I realized that my strategy was going to have to change. I'd been thinking of Marcus as my enemy, but maybe he was actually the key to bringing down his mother's entire operation. If I could find a way to reach the real Marcus, the one buried under years of medication and manipulation, maybe I could turn Victoria Wellington's greatest weapon against her, but time was running out. Every day I didn't respond to Victoria's demands was another day closer to whatever less pleasant measures she had in mind. And if the medical records were any indication, Those measures would be far more sophisticated and far more final than I'd originally imagined. Janet and I spent the next week building what she called an airtight case, evidence, so compelling that even the Wellington family's money and influence couldn't suppress it. We worked out of her small office above a Chinese restaurant, surrounded by boxes of documents, photographs, and legal files that painted a picture of systematic corruption spanning decades. The financial records were the most damning. Janet had traced the Wellington family's charitable donations through a maze of shell companies and offshore accounts. What appeared to be legitimate philanthropy was actually an elaborate money laundering operation. The Wellington Foundation would donate to fake charities, which would then funnel the money back to the family through consulting fees and administrative costs. But it was the pattern of payments to individuals that really caught our attention. Every few years, there would be a large cash withdrawal from one of the family's accounts, always between $50,000 and $100,000, always with no clear business purpose. The timing of these withdrawals corresponded perfectly with the periods when women disappeared from Marcus's life. "Look at this," Janet said, pointing to a series of bank records spread across her desk. Jennifer Hayes wasn't the first. There were at least 3 others before her, going back almost 15 years. Different amounts, but always the same pattern. Young women, working-class backgrounds, all of them mysteriously cutting off contact with Marcus around the same time these payments were made. I studied the dates and amounts, feeling sick. 3 other women, 3 other pregnancies, most likely. 3 other lives that had been deemed inconvenient to the Wellington family legacy. What happened to them? I asked. That's what we need to find out. But based on what we know about Jennifer, I'm not optimistic. We'd also discovered evidence of the Wellington family's connections to local law enforcement and city officials. Campaign contributions, charitable donations, and personal favors had bought them a network of protection that explained how Jennifer's murder had been so easily covered up. Police Captain Robert Morrison, who'd overseen the Jennifer Hayes investigation, had received a $50,000 donation to his daughter's private school tuition fund. Just weeks after the case was closed, the medical examiner who'd ruled Jennifer's death and overdose had been hired as a consultant by one of the Wellington family's companies immediately after his retirement. The corruption was breathtaking in its scope and efficiency. The Wellington family hadn't just bought silence, they'd bought an entire system of protection that allowed them to operate with complete impunity. But Janet had also found their weakness. Thomas Crawford, the man Lisa Hayes had identified as the Wellington family's cleaner, had been sloppy. He'd used the same aliases and cover identities for multiple jobs, leaving a paper trail that connected him to at least 5 suspicious deaths over the past decade. Crawford's our smoking gun, Janet explained. He's been cleaning up the Wellington family's messes for years, but he's gotten careless. If we can tie him directly to Jennifer's death, we can bring down the whole operation. The challenge was getting Crawford to talk. He was currently serving a short sentence in county jail on an unrelated assault charge. Apparently, he'd gotten drunk and picked a fight with the wrong person at a bar. Janet thought this might be our opportunity. Men like Crawford are loyal, as long as they're being paid, she said. But when they're sitting in a jail cell, wondering if their employers are going to abandon them, they start thinking about self-preservation. We developed a 2-pronged strategy. While Janet worked on flipping Crawford, I would focus on gathering evidence that could be used in court. This meant documenting everything the Wellington family was doing to intimidate me, as well as building a timeline of their past crimes. The intimidation had already begun in earnest. I'd started noticing the same car parked outside my apartment building at different times of day. My phone had developed strange echoes and clicking sounds that suggested it was being monitored. I'd received several hang-up calls in the middle of the night. Most unnervingly, someone had broken into my apartment while I was at work. Nothing had been stolen, but things had been moved around, books rearranged on shelves, papers shuffled on my desk, clothes displaced in my closet. It was a clear message. We can get to you anytime we want. I started carrying a small digital recorder in my purse, documenting every strange occurrence, every veiled threat, every sign that I was being watched. I also began staying at different locations each night, sometimes with friends, sometimes at cheap motels, sometimes in Janet's office. The goal was to be unpredictable, to make it harder for them to track my movements. But the most important part of our strategy was building legal protection. Janet had connected me with a lawyer named David Kim, a former prosecutor who specialized in taking on powerful defendants. Kim was expensive, but he agreed to take my case on a contingency basis after reviewing the evidence we gathered. "This is bigger than just your situation," Kim explained during our first meeting. "If we can prove what the Wellington family has been doing, we're looking at RICO charges, conspiracy, murder. This could bring down their entire operation." Kim immediately filed for restraining orders against Victoria Wellington and Thomas Crawford, as well as motions to preserve evidence and prevent the destruction of documents. He also arranged for me to give a detailed deposition that would be stored in multiple secure locations, ensuring that my testimony would survive even if something happened to me. As we built our case, I found myself thinking more and more about the other women who hadn't had the resources to fight back. Jennifer Hayes had died alone and afraid, with only her sister to remember her truth. But she wouldn't die in vain if her story helped bring justice for everyone who came after her. The Wellington family had counted on their victims being isolated, powerless, and afraid. They'd counted on women like me taking the money and disappearing quietly, but they'd made a crucial miscalculation. They'd assumed that all victims were the same, that fear and money could silence anyone. They were about to learn how wrong they were. And by the time I was finished with them, they'd understand that some fights are worth having, regardless of the cost. The breakthrough came at 2 a.m. on a Thursday. I was staying in a motel outside the city when my phone rang, Janet's number flashing on the screen with an urgency that made my heart race. "We got him," she said without preamble. "Crawford flipped. He's ready to talk." I was dressed and driving toward the county jail within 10 minutes. Janet met me in the parking lot, her usually composed demeanor replaced by barely contained excitement. "He's scared," she explained as we walked toward the building. Apparently, Victoria Wellington hasn't been returning his lawyer's calls since he was arrested. He's starting to realize that loyalty is a one-way street with these people. Thomas Crawford was nothing like I'd expected. Instead of the imposing figure I'd imagined, he was a small, nervous man with thinning hair and the kind of defeated posture that came from years of doing other people's dirty work. He sat across from us in the jail's consultation room, fidgeting with a plastic cup of coffee. "I want immunity," he said before we'd even introduced ourselves. "Full immunity, witness protection, the whole deal. Because if I tell you what I know, I'm a dead man." Janet had arranged for David Kim to be present, and he leaned forward with the careful attention of a prosecutor who'd just been handed the key to a major case. "That depends on what you have to tell us," Kim said. "But I can promise you this cooperation will be taken into account when we determine charges." Crawford looked at me for a long moment, his eyes filled with something that might have been regret. "You look like her," he said quietly. "Jennifer. Same age, same hope, I guess." "Before everything went wrong." "Tell us about Jennifer," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the churning in my stomach. "What Crawford told us over the next 2 hours was worse than anything we'd imagined. Jennifer Hayes hadn't died from a drug overdose, she'd been murdered. Slowly and deliberately, with a combination of drugs that would mimic a heroin overdose but leave no trace of foul play. Mrs. Wellington wanted it to look like suicide," Crawford explained, his voice barely above a whisper. Said it would be better for everyone if Jennifer just disappeared. Less messy than the other methods. Other methods? Kim Prescott Crawford nodded reluctantly. There were others before Jennifer, car accidents, mostly. Made to look like drunk driving or mechanical failure. But those were getting too much attention, too many questions. The overdose was cleaner. He'd been recording his conversations with Victoria Wellington for years, he told us, partly as insurance, partly because he'd suspected that eventually she'd try to eliminate him too. He had audio evidence of Victoria ordering Jennifer's death, as well as recordings discussing the murders of 2 other women, who'd become inconvenient to the family. But the most shocking revelation came when Crawford produced a small digital recorder from his pocket. I recorded our last conversation, he said, looking directly at me. The one where she told me to handle you the same way we handled Jennifer. The recording was crystal clear. Victoria Wellington's voice, cold and precise, giving instructions. For my murder. She wanted it to look like a suicide brought on by depression over my failed relationship with Marcus. Crawford was to break into my apartment, force-feed me pills, and stage the scene to look like I'd taken my own life out of despair. She said the pregnancy made it even better, Crawford continued, his voice thick with disgust. Said people would understand why a single pregnant woman might choose to end it all. More believable than another overdose. As I listened to the recording, I felt a cold fury settle in my chest. This woman had been planning my death with the same casual efficiency she might use to plan a dinner party. My life, my child's life, meant nothing to her except as obstacles to be removed. But Crawford's cooperation came with a price. Victoria Wellington suspected that he might turn against her, and she'd already put backup plans in motion. There was another cleaner, someone Crawford didn't know, who'd been hired to eliminate both me and Crawford himself. She's accelerating the timeline, he warned. Originally, she was going to wait another week or 2, let you think you were safe. But she knows you're gathering evidence, knows you're not going to take her money and disappear. She's planning to move against you. Within the next 48 hours, Kim immediately arranged for police protection, but we all knew that local law enforcement couldn't be completely trusted. Too many of them were on the Wellington family payroll, and there was no way to know which officers could be relied upon. Instead, Janet arranged for private security former federal agents who specialized in protecting witnesses against organized crime. It was expensive, but Kim assured me that the costs would eventually be recovered when we sued the Wellington family into bankruptcy as we prepared to leave the jail. Crawford grabbed my arm. There's something else, he said. Something about Marcus. He doesn't know about any of this. His mother keeps him so drugged up that he barely knows what day it is, let alone what she's doing to protect him. She's been telling him that all his old girlfriends just moved away, found someone else. This revelation hit me harder than I'd expected. I've been preparing to hate Marcus, to see him as complicit in his mother's crimes. But if Crawford was telling the truth, Marcus was as much a victim as the rest of us, a prisoner in his own life. Kept docile and compliant through a combination of drugs and lies. He loved Jennifer, Crawford continued, really loved her. When she died, he tried to kill himself. That's when his mother increased his medication, took away his access to anything that might help him think clearly. She's been controlling him completely ever since. As we drove away from the jail, I found myself thinking about Marcus in a new light. Not as the enemy, but as another casualty of his mother's ruthless ambition. Another life destroyed by Victoria. Wellington's determination to maintain control at any cost, but understanding didn't mean forgiveness, and sympathy didn't change the danger I was in. Victoria Wellington had already ordered my death, and time was running out. The next 48 hours would determine whether I lived to see my child born. or whether I became another convenient suicide in the Wellington family's long history of eliminating problems. The war was no longer coming, it was here. And everything I'd worked for, everything I'd discovered, would mean nothing if I didn't survive long enough to see justice done. The safe house was a nondescript apartment in a complex across town, chosen specifically because it was the last place anyone would look for someone hiding from the Wellington family. My security detail consisted of 2 former FBI agents, Marcus Chen and Sarah Rodriguez, who took 12-hour shifts protecting me while David Kim worked frantically to get emergency injunctions and protective orders, but legal protection moved slowly, and Victoria Wellington was operating on a different timeline. The morning after Crawford's confession, she launched what Janet called a full-court press, a coordinated attack designed to discredit me and destroy our case. Before it could reach trial, the first assault came through the media. Someone had leaked my personal information to a gossip blogger who specialized in taking down women who dared to challenge powerful men. Within hours, my face was plastered across social media with accusations that I was a gold digger who'd deliberately gotten pregnant to trap Marcus Wellington into marriage. The articles painted me as an opportunistic teacher who'd seduced a wealthy man and was now trying to extort money from his family. They included photos of my modest apartment, my secondhand car, my student loan debt, all presented as evidence of my desperate financial situation and supposed motive for targeting the Wellingtons. It's character assassination, David Kim explained, as we watched the story spread across social media. Classic strategy for discrediting witnesses before they can testify. They're trying to make you look like a liar and a manipulator. But the media attack was just the beginning. Victoria Wellington was also working behind the scenes to destroy my professional life. My school principal received an anonymous tip that I was under investigation for embezzling from the Student Activity Fund. The allegation was completely false, but it was enough to get me suspended pending an internal investigation. My landlord suddenly decided to sell my apartment building, giving all tenants 30 days to vacate. My bank account was frozen due to suspicious activity that triggered an automatic fraud investigation. My car insurance was canceled after someone reported that I'd been driving under the influence. Another completely fabricated claim that would take weeks to sort out. She's trying to isolate you, Agent Chen explained. Take away your support systems, your financial resources, your ability to function independently. It's psychological warfare designed to make you feel helpless and desperate. The strategy was sophisticated and comprehensive. Within 48 hours, Victoria Wellington had managed to make me unemployed, effectively homeless and financially vulnerable. If I'd been the naive teacher she thought I was, I might have cracked under the pressure and taken whatever deal she offered just to make it stop, but I wasn't alone anymore. Janet had been documenting every attack, every false allegation, every obvious attempt at intimidation. Each move Victoria made was adding to our evidence file, creating a paper trail that showed the extent of her willingness to destroy innocent people. More importantly, Crawford's testimony had opened doors we hadn't known existed. Federal investigators were now involved, treating the Wellington family operation as an organized crime enterprise. Agent Lissa Morrison from the FBI's white-collar crime division had taken over coordination of my protection, bringing resources that even the Wellington family couldn't buy or intimidate. We've been watching the Wellington family for years, Agent Morrison explained during a briefing at the safe house, but we never had a witness willing to testify about their direct involvement in violence. Crawford's confession changes everything. The federal investigation revealed just how extensive the Wellington family's criminal network had become. They weren't just murdering inconvenient women, they were using their charitable foundation to launder money for organized crime, providing services to other wealthy families who needed their own problems handled. Victoria Wellington had turned her family's legitimate business into the center of a criminal enterprise that spanned multiple states and involved dozens of corrupt officials. The scope of the operation was staggering, and the potential sentences, if convicted, would effectively end the Wellington family legacy forever. But bringing down a criminal empire took time, and Victoria Wellington was still operating freely while the investigation proceeded. She'd hired her own team of private investigators to track down every aspect of my life. Looking for weaknesses they could exploit, they found my mother. Elena Mitchell lived in a retirement community in Florida, where she'd moved after my father's death 3 years ago. She was 72 years old, in good health, and completely unaware that her daughter was fighting for her life against one of the most dangerous families in the country. The attack on my mother was subtle but devastating. Someone filed complaints with the state health department about the retirement community where she lived, alleging safety violations and financial improprieties. The facility was forced to undergo intensive inspections and temporarily lost its license to house residents with certain medical conditions. My mother, who took medication for high blood pressure and diabetes, was suddenly told she'd have to find alternative housing within 2 weeks. The stress of being forced to move, combined with the confusion and fear of not understanding why it was happening, triggered a minor heart episode that landed her in the hospital. When I called her from the safe house, she sounded frail and confused. "I don't understand what's happening, Sarah," she said through tears. "They're saying I have to leave my home, but I don't have anywhere else to go. And the doctors won't tell me why my heart is acting up." The cruelty of using my elderly mother as a weapon against me was breathtaking. Victoria Wellington had found the one person I would sacrifice everything to protect, and she was using my love for my mother as leverage to force my cooperation. "This is what they do," Agent Morrison explained when I told her about my mother's situation. "They find your pressure points and exploit them until you break, but we can protect her too. We just need to move fast." The federal agents arranged for my mother to be transferred to a secure medical facility where she could receive proper care, while staying safe from Wellington family retaliation. But the message was clear. Victoria Wellington was willing to hurt anyone, including innocent elderly people, to maintain her control. As I sat in the safe house that night, watching the news coverage of my supposed extortion scheme against the Wellington family, I realized that this fight had become about more than just me and my baby. It was about every person Victoria Wellington had ever hurt, every family she'd destroyed, every life she'd considered expendable in pursuit of her goals. The final battle was coming, and everything I'd worked for would be decided in the next few days. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt ready. I had allies now, resources, evidence, and most importantly, the absolute certainty that what I was doing was right. Victoria Wellington had built her empire on the assumption that money could buy anything and anyone. She was about to learn that some things, justice, truth, the right to exist without fear, simply weren't for sale. The truth about the Wellington family's deepest secret came from the most unexpected source: a birth certificate that Janet found buried in the county records office, misfiled under a different name and dated 27 years ago. The child's name was Michael Robert Hayes, Jennifer Hayes' younger brother, who had supposedly died in infancy according to the family stories Lisa had told me. But the birth certificate told a different story. Michael Hayes hadn't died. He'd been adopted, and his adoptive name was Marcus Jonathan Wellington. I stared at the document in Janet's office, my hands trembling as the implications crashed over me. Marcus wasn't Victoria Wellington's biological son. He was Jennifer's brother, adopted by the Wellington family as an infant and raised as their heir without ever knowing his true identity. "Jesus Christ," Janet whispered, slumping back in her chair. "Do you understand what this means?" I understood perfectly. Victoria Wellington hadn't just murdered Jennifer Hayes. She'd murdered her own adopted son's sister. Marcus had been manipulated into participating in the cover-up of his own sister's death, kept drugged and compliant while the woman he called mother destroyed his biological family. But there was more. Janet had found additional records, adoption papers that revealed the full scope of Victoria Wellington's deception. Michael Hayes had been taken from his teenage mother, Jennifer and Lisa's mother, when she was deemed unfit to raise him due to poverty and mental health issues. The adoption had been arranged through a private agency that specialized in placing children with wealthy families. Victoria Wellington, unable to have children of her own, had specifically requested a male infant who could serve as heir to the Wellington fortune. She'd paid substantial fees to ensure that the adoption records were sealed and that the biological family would have no contact with the child. What she'd gotten was not just a son, but a perfect victim for her psychological manipulation. Marcus had grown up feeling grateful for being saved from poverty, never knowing that his gratitude was based on a lie. His mental health struggles, which Victoria used to justify her control over him, might have been triggered by the subconscious knowledge that something fundamental about his identity was wrong. "Look at this," Janet said, showing me another document. It was a psychological evaluation from Marcus's teenage years, conducted when he'd started asking questions about his adoption. The psychologist had noted that Marcus showed signs of identity confusion and displacement anxiety, symptoms consistent with adopted children who sensed that their adoption story didn't match their emotional reality. Victoria's response had been to increase his therapy and introduce the first mood-stabilizing medications. Instead of helping him work through his identity issues, she drugged him into compliance and told him that his questions about his past were symptoms of mental illness. The cruelest irony was that Marcus had been drawn to Jennifer not just because of romantic attraction, but because of biological connection. Siblings separated in infancy often experience an unexplained pull toward each other when they meet as adults. What Marcus had interpreted as love at first sight might have been the recognition of family. She knew, I said, the full horror of the situation becoming clear. Victoria knew exactly who Jennifer was when Marcus brought her home. She knew she was his sister. Janet nodded grimly. Which means she didn't just kill Jennifer to protect the family reputation. She killed her to prevent Marcus from ever learning the truth about his identity. The birth certificate was more than just evidence of murder. It was proof of a lifetime of psychological abuse that had destroyed not one but two families. Victoria Wellington had stolen a child, erased his identity, and then murdered his sister to maintain her lie. But it also gave us the key to bringing down her entire operation. Marcus wasn't just a victim of his mother's control. He was the rightful heir to whatever remained of the Hayes family estate, and potentially a claimant to portions of the Wellington fortune that had been built on fraud. More importantly, learning the truth about his identity might be enough to break through the pharmaceutical fog that kept him compliant. If we could reach the real Marcus, the Michael Hayes, who'd been buried under years of drugs and lies, we might be able to turn. Victoria's greatest weapon against her David Kim was ecstatic when we brought him the birth certificate. "This changes everything," he said, pacing around his office like a caged tiger. "We're not just talking about murder anymore. We're talking about identity theft, fraud, conspiracy, kidnapping charges that could put Victoria Wellington away for the rest of her life. But using this information would require reaching Marcus, and that meant finding a way to get past his security, his medication regimen, and his mother's surveillance. It was a dangerous gamble, because if Victoria discovered what we knew before, we could act on it. She'd accelerate her plans to eliminate both Marcus and me. "There's something else," Janet said, producing one final document from her research. It was a copy of the original adoption contract, and buried in the fine print was a clause that changed everything we thought we knew about the Wellington family's motivations. If Marcus ever discovered his true identity, or if the adoption was Ever legally challenged, the entire Wellington estate would revert to a trust controlled by the adoption agency. Victoria Wellington didn't just risk losing her son. If the truth came out, she risked losing everything. The Wellington fortune, the family business, the estate, the foundation, all of it was built on the legal fiction that Marcus was Victoria's biological heir. If that fiction was exposed, the carefully constructed empire would collapse overnight. That's why she's so desperate to eliminate anyone who might threaten the secret, Kim realized. It's not just about family reputation anymore. It's about survival. If this comes out, Victoria Wellington loses everything. As I sat in the safe house that night, holding the birth certificate that contained the power to destroy the Wellington family, I thought about Marcus Michael Hayes sleeping in his drug-induced haze, unaware that his entire life was a lie. Tomorrow, we would try to wake him up. Tomorrow, we would try to give him back his name, his identity, and his choice about what to do with the truth. But tonight, I mourned for the family that had been destroyed to create the Wellington legacy, and I prepared for the battle that would finally bring justice for Jennifer Hayes and her brother Michael, who deserved to know who he really was. I found Marcus at Jennifer's grave. It was early morning, just after sunrise, and he was sitting on a stone bench 20 feet from her headstone, staring at the simple granite marker that read, Jennifer Marie Hayes, beloved daughter and sister. In his hand was a bouquet of white roses that he hadn't yet placed on the grave. Agent Chun had followed him there from his apartment, where he'd apparently been going every morning for the past week. Victoria thought he was attending early morning business meetings. Instead, he was visiting the grave of the sister he'd never known he had. Marcus, I said softly, approaching the bench where he sat. He looked up at me with eyes that were clearer than I'd seen them in months, as if grief had burned through some of the pharmaceutical haze that usually clouded his thoughts. Sarah, his voice was hoarse, tired. I figured you'd find me eventually. I've been waiting. I sat beside him on the bench, close enough to see the dark circles under his eyes, the way his hands shook slightly from medication withdrawal. How long have you been coming here? Since the night you told me about the baby. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think. I kept having dreams about Jennifer, about finding her that morning. He turned to look at me, and I saw tears in his eyes. I know my mother told you I don't remember much about Jennifer's death, but that's not true. I remember everything. I just haven't been allowed to talk about it. The admission hung between, used like a confession. He knew more than he'd been pretending, more than his mother realized. Whatever drugs Victoria had been giving him were losing their effectiveness, or he'd been finding ways to avoid taking them. What do you remember? I asked gently. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring at Jennifer's headstone. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I remember that she was afraid. The last time I saw her, she kept looking over her shoulder, jumping at every sound. She said someone had been following her, that she'd found things moved around in her apartment. He set the roses on the bench between us and pulled out a small photograph. Jennifer, smiling, with her hand resting on her barely visible pregnant belly. She gave me this the night before she died. Said she wanted me to have it in case something happened to her. I've carried it ever since. Marcus, I said carefully, there's something you need to know about Jennifer, something your mother never told you. I handed him the birth certificate that had changed everything. He stared at it for a long time, reading it over and over as if the words might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. Michael Robert Hayes, he read aloud. Born February 15th, 1992. His birth date, his real name. The truth he'd been denied his entire life. Jennifer was your sister, Marcus. Your biological sister. Victoria Wellington adopted you as an infant and erased your connection to your birth family. Jennifer never knew who you really were when you started dating, but on some level you recognized each other. The photograph slipped from his fingers and fluttered to the ground. For a moment, I thought he might collapse entirely. His face went through a series of emotions: disbelief, horror, understanding, and finally, a cold fury that I'd never seen from him before. "She knew," he said, his voice stronger now. My mother knew exactly who Jennifer was. She knew I was falling in love with my own sister, and she let it happen. She watched me grieve for Jennifer, watched me blame myself for her death, and she never said a word. "There's more," I said, and told him everything we'd discovered. The other murders, the systematic elimination of anyone who threatened the family secrets, the fact that his entire inheritance was built on fraud. I watched his face change as each revelation hit him, watched years of carefully constructed lies crumble away. When I finished, Marcus stood up and walked to Jennifer's grave. He placed the white roses on the headstone and stood there for several minutes, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "I loved her," he said finally. "Not romantically. I understand now why that felt wrong, why I could never quite connect with her the way she wanted. But I loved her as family, in a way I didn't understand at the time, and my mother murdered her for it." He turned back to me, and the man I saw was different from the Marcus I'd known. The medication-dulled compliance was gone, replaced by a sharp intelligence and a determination that reminded me of the person he might have been if he'd been allowed to grow up knowing the truth. "She's planning to kill you too, isn't she?" he asked. I nodded. "She's already tried. We have recordings, evidence, witnesses, but she's still free, still dangerous. Not for much longer." Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out a small digital recorder. "I've been documenting everything for the past 2 weeks. Every conversation, every instruction, every order she's given me, including her plans for you." He played a portion of the recording, Victoria's voice, clear and unmistakable, discussing the timeline from my accident and Marcus's expected response to my death. She'd been coaching him on how to grieve convincingly, how to play the heartbroken boyfriend for the media. "She's been planning this for weeks," Marcus continued. "Ever since you refused to take her money, she has backup plans, alternative scenarios, contingencies for every possible outcome, except one." "What's that?" "She never planned for me to remember who I really am." Marcus told me that he'd been gradually reducing his medication for months, substituting placebos and skipping doses when possible. The process was dangerous withdrawal from psychiatric medications. Could be life-threatening, but he'd been determined to think clearly for the first time in years. I started having dreams about a woman with dark hair who would sing to me. He explained. Always the same song, always the same gentle voice. When I met Jennifer, I recognized the voice. I knew there was a connection, but I couldn't figure out what it was. The woman in his dreams had been his birth mother, and the song was a lullaby that Jennifer had learned from her before their family was torn apart. Even drugged and isolated, some part of Marcus had retained the memory of his real family. "What do you want to do?" I asked that. Marcus looked at me with eyes that were fully alert for the first time since I'd known him. "I want to stop her. I want to make sure she never hurts another person the way she hurt Jennifer, the way she's hurt you. But most of all, I want to make sure our child grows up knowing the truth." Our child. He'd said it so naturally, so matter-of-factly, that it took me a moment to process the words. "Marcus, I know I don't have the right to ask for anything," he said quickly. "I know I'm responsible for what happened to Jennifer, for what's happening to you. I should have been stronger, should have fought against her control years ago. But if you'll let me, I want to help you finish this. I want to help you bring her down." I studied his face, looking for any sign of the manipulation or weakness I'd come to expect from him. Instead, I saw something I'd never seen before, genuine. Remorse, real determination, and the kind of quiet strength that could only come from someone who'd finally stopped running from the truth. "Okay," I said, "but we do this my way with my team, following my plan." And if you betray me, if you go back to her, I won't, he said firmly. Michael Hayes is done being Victoria Wellington's victim, and Marcus Wellington is done being her son. As we walked away from Jennifer's grave together, I felt something I hadn't expected. Hope. Not for a romantic reconciliation. Too much had happened for that to ever be possible. But hope that justice was finally within reach, and that the child I was carrying might grow up in a world where the Wellington family's reign of terror had finally come to an end. The confrontation took place in the Wellington family mansion, in the same grand parlor where I'd first met Victoria Wellington 8 months earlier. But this time, I wasn't the naive teacher who'd been intimidated by wealth and privilege. I was Sarah Mitchell, armed with evidence, surrounded by federal agents, and accompanied by the son Victoria thought she controlled. The morning headlines had already begun the process of destroying her carefully constructed world. Wellington family, charged in decades-long murder conspiracy, screamed across the front page of every major newspaper. Crawford's testimony, combined with the evidence we gathered, had been enough for federal prosecutors to issue arrest warrants for Victoria Wellington and her entire network of accomplices, but Victoria had refused to surrender quietly. Instead, she'd barricaded herself in the family estate, surrounded by private security and lawyers determined to fight until the end. The FBI had the house surrounded, but they'd agreed to let me try to end this peacefully before they moved in with force. "You look well, Sarah," Victoria said as I entered the parlor, flanked by Agent Morrison and David Kim. She was seated in the same wingback chair from the family portrait, dressed impeccably despite the circumstances, her silver hair perfectly arranged. "Considering the stress you've been under?" "The stress of being targeted for murder, you mean?" She smiled coldly. "The stress of making very poor choices. This could have been resolved so much more simply if you'd just taken my generous offer." Marcus entered the room behind us, and I watched Victoria's expression change from confident arrogance to genuine shock. Her son, her weapon, her carefully controlled puppet, was supposed to be heavily sedated in his bedroom, unaware of what was happening. Instead, he was alert, focused, and looking at her with an expression of absolute contempt. "Hello, Mother," he said, and the way he pronounced the word made it sound like a curse. Or should I say kidnapper? Victoria's composure cracked for just a moment before she regained control. "Marcus, darling, you're not well. You need your medication. These people have filled your head with lies. These people told me the truth." Marcus interrupted. "The truth you've spent 27 years hiding. I know who I really am, Victoria. I know what you did to my family." He walked to the mantel and picked up the family portrait, the one with the empty space that had always bothered me. With deliberate care, he turned it around to show the back, where a smaller photograph had been taped to the frame. It was a picture of Jennifer and Marcus as children, sitting together on a porch swing, both of them laughing. "I found this in." "You're safe," Marcus said. "Along with all the other photographs of my real family, you kept them like trophies, didn't you? Reminders of the lives you destroyed." Victoria's mask finally slipped completely. The gracious society matron disappeared, replaced by something cold and vicious. "You ungrateful little bastard," she hissed. "I saved you from poverty, from the gutter where you belonged. I gave you everything: education, wealth, position. And this is how you repay me?" "You stole me," Marcus replied calmly. "You murdered my sister. You destroyed my mind with drugs and lies. And you were planning to murder the mother of my child. Forgive me if I'm not feeling particularly grateful." Agent Morrison stepped forward with the arrest warrant. "Victoria Wellington, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, fraud, and kidnapping. You have the right to remain silent." "This is ridiculous," Victoria snapped, but she remained seated, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. "You have no proof of anything." Just the word of criminals and liars trying to destroy an innocent family. Actually, we have quite a bit of proof, David Kim said, producing a thick folder of documents. Financial records showing payments to Thomas Crawford for murder, recordings of you ordering Sarah's death, medical records proving your systematic drugging of your adopted son. And most damning of all, we have Marcus himself ready to testify about 27 years of psychological abuse. But Victoria wasn't finished. Even cornered, even facing life in prison, she had one last card to play. "You think you've won?" she said, looking directly at me. "You think exposing me will give you some kind of happy ending? Let me tell you what's really going to happen." She stood up slowly, her movements careful and controlled. "Marcus will testify against me, yes. But he'll also have to live with the knowledge that he participated in covering up his sister's murder. That he let me drug him into compliance while I destroyed everyone he should have protected. That guilt will eat him alive." Her words were aimed like poison arrows, designed to inflict maximum psychological damage. "And you, my dear Sarah, you'll raise your child alone because Marcus is too broken to be anyone's father. You'll tell that child about its grandfathers, family, about how they all died because Victoria Wellington decided they were inconvenient. What a lovely bedtime story that will make." But her cruelty had the opposite effect than she'd intended. Instead of breaking down, Marcus stepped closer to her, his voice steady and strong. "You're right about one thing," he said. "I will have to live with what I've done. But the difference between us is that I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to make amends. You're just going to spend the rest of yours in prison." Agent Morrison moved to place handcuffs on Victoria, but she pulled away with one final burst of defiance. "The Wellington name has stood for something in this city for 3 generations, she declared. "I will not let it be destroyed by a kindergarten teacher and a bastard child who should have died in the gutter where I found him." "The Wellington name died with Jennifer Hayes," I said quietly. "You killed it along with her. Everything you've built, everything you've protected, it's all going to be torn down. And in the end, you'll be remembered not as a society matron or a philanthropist, but as a murderer who destroyed families for money." The newspaper headlines that followed would prove my words prophetic. Wellington fortune built on murder and fraud. Society matron's decades-long killing spree exposed. Fake heir testifies against adopted mother who killed his sister. As Victoria Wellington was led away in handcuffs, ranting about injustice and conspiracies, I felt a profound sense of closure. Not happiness, too many people had died for that, but satisfaction that Jennifer Hayes would finally have justice, and that no other woman would suffer at Victoria Wellington's hands. The empire she'd built on lies and blood was crumbling, and from its ashes, something better would grow. Marcus had already announced his intention to liquidate the family assets and establish a foundation in Jennifer's name, dedicated to helping victims of domestic violence and family abuse. It wasn't the ending I'd imagined when I first told Marcus about my pregnancy, but it was the ending that mattered. Truth had triumphed over lies, justice over wealth, and love over fear. And for the first time in months, I could think about the future without terror, both for myself and for the child, who would grow up in a world where the Wellington family could never hurt anyone again. 6 months later, I sat in a federal courthouse watching Victoria Wellington receive 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. She'd aged dramatically during the trial, her perfect composure finally cracking under the weight of testimony from dozens of witnesses who told stories of intimidation, corruption, and murder. The evidence against her had been overwhelming. Crawford's recordings, the financial records Janet had uncovered, and most damaging of all, Marcus's testimony about a lifetime of psychological abuse and manipulation. The jury had deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty. Verdicts on all counts. Victoria's network of accomplices had fallen like dominoes. Police Captain Morrison, the medical examiner, city officials, judges, all of them were facing their own trials or had already been sentenced. The corruption she'd fostered had infected multiple levels of government and law enforcement, requiring a massive federal investigation to root out completely. But it was the civil trial that provided the most satisfaction. Marcus had sued his adoptive mother for fraud, demanding the return of assets that rightfully belonged to the Hayes family. The court had ruled that the entire Wellington, fortune built on the lie of Marcus's identity, should be placed in a trust administered by Jennifer's surviving family members. Lisa Hayes had been appointed as the primary trustee, with Marcus serving as an advisor. Together, they'd established the Jennifer Hayes Foundation, dedicated to helping victims of family violence and providing legal assistance to people fighting powerful adversaries. The foundation's first major grant had funded a legal clinic that specialized in taking on cases similar to mine. "It feels strange," Marcus had told me after the sentencing. "Growing up thinking I was an heir to this great fortune and now learning that it was all based on lies. But seeing it used to help people instead of hurt them, that feels right." The physical and emotional toll of the past year had been enormous. I'd suffered from stress-related complications during my pregnancy that required bed rest and careful monitoring. The constant fear, the media attention, the pressure of knowing that powerful people wanted me dead. It had all taken its toll on both me and my unborn child, but I'd had help. My mother had recovered from her heart episode and moved back to the city to be near me during the trial. Lisa Hayes had become an unexpected friend and ally, someone who understood the unique trauma of fighting the Wellington family. Even Janet Chun had become more than just an investigator. She'd become a mentor and a reminder that justice was worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. The trial had also revealed the full scope of Victoria Wellington's crimes. In addition to Jennifer Hayes, investigators had confirmed that she'd been responsible for the deaths of at least 6 other women over the past 15 years. Each of them had been involved with Marcus or posed some other threat to the family's reputation. Pattern was always the same: intimidation, bribery, and when those failed, murder disguised as suicide or accident. Victoria had perfected the art of making inconvenient people disappear, always leaving enough plausible deniability to avoid suspicion. But the discovery that had shocked everyone, including the prosecutors, was the existence of other adopted children. Marcus wasn't the only child Victoria had stolen from poor families. Over the years, she'd arranged for the adoption of at least 12 children, using them as tools in various schemes to defraud inheritance laws and tax regulations. Most of these children had been given new identities and placed with families in the Wellington network, growing up unaware of their true origins. The FBI was still working to identify them all and reunite them with their biological families where possible. The revelation had sent shockwaves through the adoption system, leading to new regulations and oversight procedures designed to prevent similar abuses. Victoria Wellington's crimes had exposed vulnerabilities in the system that allowed wealthy people to essentially purchase children and erase their identities. For Marcus, learning about the other stolen children had been almost as devastating as discovering his own true identity. He'd thrown himself into helping the FBI track down these other victims, using his inside knowledge of his adoptive mother's methods to identify potential leads. "I keep thinking about how many families she destroyed," he told me during one of our conversations. "How many siblings were separated, how many parents lost their children. It's not enough to just punish her, we have to try to fix what she broke." The media coverage of the trial had been intense but largely sympathetic. The story of a kindergarten teacher taking on a corrupt dynasty had captured public imagination, and I'd received thousands of letters of support from people who'd faced their own battles against powerful adversaries, But the attention had also brought unwanted scrutiny. Every aspect of my life had been examined and dissected in the press. My teaching methods, my finances, my relationship with Marcus, everything had been fair game for journalists and bloggers. Looking for any angle that might generate clicks, I learned to navigate the media attention with help from a publicist that David Kim had recommended. The key she taught me was to stay focused on the larger message that ordinary people could fight back against corruption and win, but only if they were willing to persist despite the costs. The sonogram photo from my latest doctor's appointment showed a healthy baby girl due in just 3 months. I decided to name her Jennifer in honor of the woman whose story had started this entire journey. It seemed fitting that something beautiful should grow from such tragedy. Marcus and I found an unexpected friendship in the aftermath of the trial. Romance was impossible. Too much had happened. Too many lies had been told. Too much pain had been inflicted for us to ever recapture what we'd once had. But we'd both been changed by the experience, and we'd both committed to making. Sure, our daughter grew up knowing the truth about her family history. She knew about Jennifer, Marcus had promised. She knew about the Hayes family, about what her grandmother did, about why we fought so hard to expose the truth. But most of all, she knew that she's loved and that she comes from people who believed in doing the right thing, even when it was dangerous. As I sat in my apartment that evening, hand resting on my growing belly, I thought about the future I was building for my daughter. It wasn't the fairy tale ending I'd once imagined, but it was something better. A future built on truth, justice, and the knowledge that some fights are worth having, regardless of the cost. The Wellington name would live on in textbooks and true crime documentaries as a cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of wealth and power. That the Hayes name would live on in the foundation that helped victims fight back, in the legal clinic that provided hope to the powerless, and in the little girl who would grow up knowing that her family had chosen justice over comfort, truth over lies, and love over fear. Jennifer Elizabeth Mitchell was born on a crisp October morning, weighing 7 pounds and 4 ounces, with dark hair and the kind of piercing blue eyes that seemed to see everything. When the nurse placed her in my arms for the first time, I felt a completeness that I hadn't known was missing, not just from becoming a mother, but from knowing that this child would grow up free from the shadows that had haunted her. Father's family for generations. Marcus was there for the birth, standing quietly in the corner of the delivery room, with tears streaming down his face. We'd agreed that he would be involved in Jenny's life as her father, but that our relationship would remain platonic. Too much had happened between us for romance to ever be possible again. But we'd built something more valuable: mutual respect, shared purpose, and an unshakable commitment to giving our daughter the truth that he'd been denied. "She looks like Jennifer," he whispered when I let him hold her for the first time. "Like my sister. Like she's carrying on something that was almost lost." The birth announcement I sent to friends and family was simple. Jennifer Elizabeth Mitchell, born October 15th, 2025, named for a brave woman who deserved better, loved beyond measure, and raised to know the difference between right and wrong. The responses poured in from around the world. Former students and their families, journalists who'd covered the trial, complete strangers who'd followed our story and wanted to express their support. But the most meaningful message came from Lisa Hayes, who'd driven up from her new home in the city to meet her namesake. "She's perfect," Lisa said, cradling Jenny with the practiced ease of someone who'd raised her own children. Jennifer would have loved her so much. She always talked about having children, about being the kind of mother who would protect them from everything harmful in the world. "She did protect her," I replied. "In a way, Jennifer protected all of us by leaving behind the evidence we needed to stop Victoria. Her story saved Jenny's life." 6 months had passed since Victoria Wellington's sentencing, and the world had moved on to other scandals and tragedies. But for those of us who'd lived through the Wellington family's reign of terror, life was permanently changed. We'd learned that justice was possible, but that it required sacrifice, persistence, and a willingness to risk everything for what was right. The Jennifer Hayes Foundation had grown beyond our wildest expectations. Donations had poured in from around the world, funding legal clinics, safe houses, and support programs for victims of family violence. Marcus had used his insider knowledge of wealthy family dynamics to help identify other potential abuse situations before they escalated to violence. My teaching career had taken an unexpected turn. After the trial, I'd been offered positions at several universities to lecture on criminal justice, family law, and victim advocacy. I'd accepted a part-time position that allowed me to stay home with Jenny while still contributing to the education of future lawyers and social workers. "You've become a symbol," Janet Chen had told me during one of our regular coffee meetings. "Whether you wanted it or not, you represent the idea that ordinary people can fight back against extraordinary corruption. That matters more than you realize." The symbol part was still uncomfortable for me. I'd never set out to be a public figure or a crusader for justice. I'd just been a kindergarten teacher who'd fallen in love with the wrong man and refused to be silenced when powerful people tried to erase me. But if my story could help other people find the courage to fight their own battles, then perhaps the pain had served a purpose. Marcus had undergone his own transformation. Free from his mother's medications and manipulation, he'd revealed himself to be intelligent, compassionate, and deeply committed to making amends for the damage done in his name. He had entered therapy to process the trauma of learning his true identity and was slowly rebuilding relationships with surviving members of the Hayes family. "I'll never be able to undo what she did," he'd told me during one of our conversations, "but I can spend the rest of my life trying to honor the people she hurt. Starting with making sure Jenny knows she comes from a family of fighters, not victims." The most unexpected development had been my relationship with my mother, who had moved permanently to the city to help with Jenny. The stress of the past year had brought us closer together, reminding us both that real family, built on love rather than obligation, was worth any sacrifice. "Your father would be so proud," she told me the night before Jenny's birth. "He always said that the law wasn't about rules and procedures. It was about standing up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. You did that, Sarah. You did exactly what he would have done." As I sat in my apartment on Jenny's first birthday, watching her take tentative steps across the living room while Marcus and my mother cheered her on, I reflected on how far we'd all come. A year ago, I'd been hiding in safe houses, terrified for my life and my unborn child's future. Now I was surrounded by family, not the family I'd originally planned, but the family that had formed itself around our shared commitment to truth and justice. Jenny would grow up knowing her father, but she'd also grow up knowing why he'd been absent during her earliest months. She'd learn about Jennifer Hayes, the aunt she'd never meet, but whose courage had made her existence possible. She'd understand that sometimes fighting for what's right means risking everything you have, but that the alternative, silence in the face of evil, is not really living at all. The Wellington family name had been erased from the society pages, and Charity Gillis replaced in the history books as a cautionary tale about the corruption of wealth and power. But the Hayes name lived on in the foundation that helped others, in the legal clinics that provided hope to the powerless, and in the little girl who would grow up understanding that her family had chosen courage over comfort, truth over convenience, and love over fear. As I tucked Jenny into her crib that night, I whispered the same promise I'd made every day since her birth. "You'll always know who you are, where you come from, and why we fought so hard to make sure you could exist. You're loved, you're safe, and you're free to become whoever you choose to be." Outside my window, the city lights twinkled like stars, and somewhere in the darkness, Other people were fighting their own battles against seemingly impossible odds. I hoped they would remember that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they refused to give up, when they insisted on telling the truth, and when they remembered that some things, dignity, justice, the right to exist without fear, were worth any price. The story that had begun with a positive pregnancy test and a briefcase full of blood money had ended with new life, hard-won justice, and the unshakable knowledge that love could triumph over even the darkest family secrets. And as I drifted off to sleep, listening to my daughter's peaceful breathing, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together, armed with the truth and the courage to use it.